This opening chapter introduces Pamela Digby at the twilight of her life as U.S. ambassador to France, contrasting her ultimate achievement with her origins in the impoverished nobility of Dorset. Born into the crumbling grandeur of Minturn Magna in 1920, young Pamela learns that aristocratic bloodlines mean nothing without the gold to sustain them. Her father, the 11th Baron Digby, possesses ancient titles but modern debts, teaching his daughter that marriage is a woman's only viable career. The narrative establishes the central paradox of wealth without security, how the trappings of privilege can mask desperate vulnerability. Through vivid descriptions of both the Parisian embassy's opulence and the damp corridors of her childhood estate, we witness a woman who spent her entire life running from poverty, only to discover that no amount of wealth could fill the void of genuine security. The chapter concludes with teenage Pamela's debutante season in 1936, where she realizes that her beauty and intelligence are currencies to be invested wisely, setting the stage for a lifetime of calculated romantic alliances. The morning mist clings to the windows of the Hotel de Pontalba like secrets reluctant to be revealed. Inside the American ambassador's residence, Pamela Harriman stands before a gilt-framed mirror, adjusting a strand of pearls that cost more than most people's homes. At 76, she remains formidable, silver hair perfectly coiffed, posture erect despite the weight of decades. Yet something in her reflection seems to whisper of mortality, of accounts that must soon be settled. She is the ultimate paradox of her age, a woman who wielded enormous power while remaining perpetually dependent on the men who granted it. The question that has haunted her since childhood echoes in the silence of the ornate room: can you ever truly own what you've only borrowed? The answer lies buried in the damp earth of Dorset, where her story began. Pamela Beryl Digby entered the world in a nursery that reeked of genteel decay. The wallpaper, once magnificent, now peeled at the corners like the family fortune itself. Outside the leaded windows, the grounds of Minturn Magna stretched across rolling hills, 400 acres of English countryside that looked magnificent but yielded little profit. Her father, Edward Digby, the 11th Baron, possessed the bearing of a man born to command, though his commands increasingly went unheeded by creditors. Her mother, Constance, navigated society with the desperate grace of someone who knew that appearances were everything when substance had fled. The Digbys had bloodlines that traced to the Norman conquest, but bloodlines, young Pamela would learn, don't pay the coal bills. The child grew up surrounded by contradictions. Servants in threadbare livery served meals on priceless china. Portraits of distinguished ancestors gazed down from walls that needed repainting. The library held first editions that couldn't be sold because they were entailed with the estate. It was a masterclass in the performance of wealth, how to project prosperity while counting every penny. At 16, Pamela made her debut into London society with the calculated precision of a general planning a campaign. The presentation at court was theatre, white dress, ostrich feathers, the ritual curtsy before King Edward VIII. But the real work happened afterward, in the drawing rooms where England's elite gathered to assess the season's crop of marriageable daughters. While other debutantes giggled nervously behind fans, Pamela engaged directly with the most powerful men in the room. She possessed an electric quality that made conversation stop when she entered a space. Her red hair caught the light like burnished copper, and her eyes held an intelligence that suggested she was always calculating several moves ahead. "You have the look of someone who understands the world," observed Lord Beaverbrook at a Mayfair dinner party, studying her with the interest of a man who collected useful people. "Most girls your age see only the surface of things." "The surface is often all that matters, Lord Beaverbrook," Pamela replied with a smile that was both innocent and knowing. "But it helps to know what lies beneath." The exchange was typical of her approach, charming but substantial, flirtatious but intelligent. She understood that beauty without brains was merely decoration, while brains without beauty were often ignored entirely. She possessed both, and more importantly, she understood how to deploy them strategically. But beneath the polished performance, pressure mounted like steam in a kettle. Her parents never spoke directly about money. Such conversations were vulgar, but their expectations hung in the air like incense. Every ball, every dinner party, every carefully orchestrated encounter was an audition for the role of her life. The other girls could afford to be romantic. Pamela was in a race against time and declining family fortunes. The London season of 1938 found Pamela, now 18, fully aware of her position in the marriage market. Europe teetered on the brink of war, and the old certainties were crumbling. But crisis, she had learned, created opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. At a weekend house party in the Cotswolds, she met Randolph Churchill. He was 27, handsome in a dissolute way, and possessed of his father's gift for rhetoric if not his judgment. Most importantly, he was a Churchill, and in a world where names mattered more than character, that surname was pure gold. Randolph was everything her practical mind told her to avoid: a gambler, a drinker, a man whose arrogance exceeded his achievements. But he was also her ticket into the highest circles of British power. As she watched him hold court at dinner, gesticulating wildly about politics while consuming alarming quantities of brandy, she made her calculation. "You're very quiet tonight, Miss Digby," he said, suddenly focusing his attention on her with the intensity of a searchlight. "Don't tell me I'm boring you with talk of Churchill family destiny." "On the contrary," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily, "I find destiny fascinating, especially when it's still being written." The courtship that followed was swift and strategic. Within months, they were engaged. Within a year, they would be married. Pamela had secured her first fortune through the oldest method known to womankind. But she had also set herself on a path that would define and ultimately consume her life. As she stood at her bedroom window at Minturn on the eve of her engagement announcement, watching the morning mist rise from the fields, she felt both triumph and foreboding. She had escaped the genteel poverty of her childhood, but she had also committed herself to a life where her security would always depend on someone else's whims. The girl from Dorset was about to become a Churchill, but the price of that transformation was her freedom to ever again be simply herself. The die was cast, and there would be no turning back. Chapter 2: The Churchill Gamble. This chapter chronicles Pamela's tumultuous marriage to Randolph Churchill and her education in the brutal realities of wartime London society. What begins as a strategic alliance quickly deteriorates into a nightmare of domestic violence, gambling debts, and abandonment. While Randolph pursues military glory and drinks away his inheritance, Pamela finds herself alone in bomb-ravaged London with an infant son. However, her isolation becomes her opportunity. She discovers that her true talent lies not in being a dutiful wife, but in becoming indispensable to powerful men who can offer what her husband cannot: security, influence, and genuine appreciation for her intelligence. Her wartime affairs with figures like Pamela Harriman and Edward R. Murrow transform her from neglected wife into a woman who understands how to leverage intimacy for power. The chapter builds to a devastating confrontation with Randolph upon his return from North Africa, where their marriage finally explodes in mutual recrimination. The emotional toll of this period forces Pamela to confront a harsh truth. In a world ruled by men, a woman's survival depends on her ability to make herself valuable to multiple patrons, not just one unreliable husband. The wedding was modest by aristocratic standards. Wartime austerity had already begun to bite. Pamela wore a simple blue suit instead of the elaborate gown she had dreamed of as a girl, and the reception was held at a London hotel rather than the grand country house ceremony her mother had envisioned. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that she was now Mrs. Randolph Churchill, daughter-in-law to the man who would soon become Britain's wartime prime minister. The honeymoon period lasted exactly 3 weeks. By November, Randolph had revealed his true nature: charming when sober, vicious when drunk, and drunk most of the time. He gambled with money they didn't have, disappeared for days without explanation, and treated his young wife like an inconvenient accessory to his grander ambitions. "You knew what you were getting," he snarled during one particularly ugly row, whiskey making his famous Churchill rhetoric slur into cruelty. "You married the name, not the man. Don't pretend you're disappointed. You're exactly where you calculated you'd be." He wasn't wrong, but the accuracy of his assessment made it hurt more, not less. The birth of her son Winston in October 1940, named for his grandfather, should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it marked the beginning of Pamela's true education in survival. Randolph showed minimal interest in fatherhood, viewing the baby primarily as proof of his virility and connection to the Churchill dynasty. Meanwhile, London burned around them as the Blitz transformed the city into a nightly inferno. Alone in their flat near Grosvenor Square, Pamela would sit in the Anderson shelter with baby Winston, listening to the whistle and crash of German bombs while her husband caroused at his club or pursued what he grandly called his military career. The irony was not lost on her. She had married for security and found herself more vulnerable than ever. But the war also brought unexpected opportunities. London was flooded with powerful Allied officers and diplomats, men far from home who sought comfort and intelligent conversation. Pamela discovered that her drawing room, modest though it was, could become a salon where strategy was discussed and alliances formed. The affair with Pamela Harriman began almost accidentally. He was President Roosevelt's special envoy, a 50-year-old millionaire with railroad fortune behind him and diplomatic immunity protecting him. More importantly, he was everything Randolph was not: stable, wealthy in his own right, and genuinely interested in what Pamela thought about the war, politics, and the future of Anglo-American relations. "You have a remarkable grasp of the political undercurrents," Harriman told her one evening as they walked through the blacked-out streets of Mayfair. "Your husband is fortunate to have such an astute partner." "My husband," Pamela replied carefully, "is rarely here to benefit from my insights." The relationship that developed was both passionate and practical. Harriman provided not just affection, but financial support, a better flat, elegant dinners, the kind of security Pamela had married Randolph to obtain, but had never received. More importantly, he treated her as an equal, someone whose opinions mattered in the great game of international politics. Other affairs followed. Edward R. Murrow, the legendary CBS broadcaster whose voice had become synonymous with London's resistance. General Fred Anderson, Air Marshal Portal. Each relationship followed a similar pattern: powerful men seeking comfort and finding in Pamela not just physical solace but intellectual stimulation and emotional support their distant wives could not provide. The confrontation came when Randolph returned from North Africa on leave, his uniform crisp, but his eyes already showing the telltale signs of too much drink and too little purpose. The gossip had reached him through a dozen different sources. His wife's affairs were the talk of military London. "So it's true," he said, standing in their drawing room like an avenging angel, though the effect was somewhat undermined by his swaying. The American envoy. The broadcaster. God knows who else. My wife, the whore of Babylon. Pamela, nursing 18-month-old Winston, looked up at her husband with eyes that had lost their last vestige of warmth. "Your wife, the survivor. While you've been playing soldier and losing money you don't have at cards, I've been ensuring our son has food and shelter." "Our son?" Randolph's laugh was bitter. "How can I be sure he's even mine, given your recreational activities?" The slap came before she even realized she had moved. Randolph staggered backward, more from surprise than force, his hand rising to his reddening cheek. "Get out," Pamela said quietly, her voice deadly calm. "Get out, and don't come back until you're sober enough to apologize. To me and to your son." "You forget yourself," Randolph snarled. "This is my flat, my money." "Your father's money," Pamela corrected. And your father values me more than he values you. Ask him which of us he'd rather have at his dinner table. It was cruel but accurate. Winston Churchill had indeed grown fond of his daughter-in-law, finding in her the political acuity and social grace his son conspicuously lacked. Randolph knew it, and the knowledge twisted in him like a knife. The marriage limped on for several more years, but that night marked its true end. Pamela had learned a crucial lesson. In a world where power was everything, she could not afford to depend on just one man, especially not one as unreliable as her husband. She would need to diversify her portfolio of protectors to make herself indispensable to multiple sources of influence and support. As she stood at the window watching Randolph stumble down the street toward his club, baby Winston sleeping peacefully in her arms, Pamela felt not grief, but liberation. She was 22 years old, notorious, and finally free to pursue the life she had always been meant to live, one where her intelligence and charm would be her fortune, and where she would never again be at the mercy of just one man's weakness. The war had taught her that survival required strategy, that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford, and that, in the great game of power, the most dangerous players were often the ones who appeared most vulnerable. She was about to become very dangerous indeed. Chapter 3. The American Seduction. Following her divorce from Randolph, Pamela faces the harsh reality of being a single mother with a scandalous reputation and no independent income. This chapter traces her strategic migration to America via Paris, where she reinvents herself as a sophisticated European divorce. Her affair with Gianni Agnelli, heir to the Fiat fortune, seems to promise the security she craves, but his family's opposition to their potential marriage forces her to confront the limitations of her strategy. The rejection by Agnelli becomes a turning point, teaching her that European aristocracy will never fully accept her. America, however, offers different opportunities. Her marriage to Broadway producer Leland Hayward brings her into the glittering world of New York theater and Hollywood glamour, providing both financial stability and social respectability. But even as she plays the perfect producer's wife, Pamela remains restless, understanding that real power lies not in Broadway but in Washington. The chapter builds toward Leland's declining health and eventual death, which threatens to leave her once again vulnerable. The crisis deepens when she discovers that his estate, while substantial, is not the fortress of security she had believed, setting the stage for her most audacious gamble yet. The City of Light was slowly awakening from its wartime slumber, but for Pamela, newly divorced and notoriously single, Paris represented both refuge and opportunity. She had rented a modest apartment on the Avenue de New York. The irony of the address was not lost on her, and set about reinventing herself once again. No longer the scandalous Mrs. Randolph Churchill, she was now simply Pamela, a mysterious English divorce with impeccable connections and a past shrouded in wartime romance. The transformation required careful orchestration. She cultivated an air of sophisticated melancholy, the beautiful woman wounded by war and love, but not broken by either. Her wardrobe evolved from London practical to Parisian chic. Her conversation, once focused on political intelligence, now danced between culture, philosophy, and just enough personal revelation to intrigue without seeming desperate. The strategy worked brilliantly. Within months, she was a fixture at the most exclusive salons, where wealthy Americans mixed with European aristocrats trying to rebuild their shattered world. She listened more than she spoke, filed away useful information, and made herself indispensable to people who could afford to be grateful. The affair with Gianni Agnelli began at a dinner party in the 16th arrondissement, where the conversation flowed as freely as the Chateau de Quem. He was everything Randolph Churchill had not been: sophisticated, genuinely wealthy, and comfortable with powerful women. The heir to the Fiat fortune possessed both old-world charm and new-world business acumen, a combination that made him irresistible to a woman who had learned to evaluate men like investment opportunities. "You're not like the other English roses," Gianni murmured as they danced at a charity ball, his hand warm against the small of her back. "You have thorns, but also substance. Most beautiful women are all surface, and most handsome men are all promise," Pamela replied, meeting his gaze with the directness that had become her trademark. "The question is whether either of us is what we appear to be." Their relationship was passionate and public, conducted against the backdrop of post-war Europe's glittering social reconstruction. For 18 months, Pamela allowed herself to believe she had found what she had been seeking, a man who could provide both love and the financial security that had eluded her since childhood. The end came with the brutal efficiency of a business decision. Gianni's family made their position clear. The heir to fiat could not marry a divorced Englishwoman with a scandalous past, no matter how charming or intelligent she might be. When he delivered the news, his face was pained, but his resolve was absolute. "I love you, Pamela," he said, standing awkwardly in her apartment as she poured tea with hands that barely trembled. "But I cannot destroy my family's empire for personal happiness. You understand this, yes? You would make the same choice." She did understand, which made the rejection hurt more, not less. She had played the game perfectly, but she had forgotten that in Europe, bloodlines and tradition still trumped individual merit. America, she realized, would have to be different. The marriage to Leland Hayward was, in many ways, her masterpiece of strategic romance. He was 23 years her senior, recently divorced, and one of Broadway's most successful producers. More importantly, he was American, part of a society that valued achievement over ancestry, where a woman's past could be rewritten if her present was sufficiently compelling. Leland was recovering from a bitter divorce when they met at a Manhattan dinner party. He needed stability and European sophistication. She needed security and American opportunity. Their courtship was mature, practical, and surprisingly affectionate. He appreciated her intelligence and social skills. She genuinely admired his creative genius and business acumen. As Mrs. Leland Hayward, Pamela transformed herself once again. She became the perfect producer's wife, elegant, charming, supremely organized. She managed his hypochondria, his creative temperament, and his complex business relationships with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Their dinner parties became legendary, gathering Broadway stars, Hollywood moguls, and political figures in a salon that rivaled anything she had created in wartime London. But even as she played her role to perfection, Pamela felt the familiar restlessness stirring. Broadway was glamorous, but it wasn't power, not real power, that lay in Washington, where the decisions that shaped the world were made. She began spending more time in the Capitol, cultivating relationships with Democratic politicians and policymakers, understanding that her future lay not in theater, but in the theater of politics. The assassination of President Kennedy sent shockwaves through the nation, but for Pamela, it also marked a personal turning point. Leland's health was deteriorating, and she found herself increasingly in the role of caretaker. The glamorous life they had built together was fading, replaced by the grim realities of illness and aging. When Leland died in 1971, the financial reality was sobering. His estate was substantial, but not enormous, much of it tied up in trusts and obligations. At 51, Pamela was wealthy by most standards, but not by the standards she had set for herself. More troubling, she was alone in a way that frightened her. The solution appeared in the form of a familiar face from her past. Pamela Harriman, now 80 years old and recently widowed, represented everything she had learned to value: immense wealth, political influence, and genuine affection for her intelligence and charm. Their wartime affair had matured into a deep friendship that had survived 3 decades and multiple marriages. Their reunion at a Georgetown dinner party was carefully orchestrated but genuinely emotional. He was older, frailer, but still sharp, still connected to the levers of democratic power. She was more mature, more sophisticated, but still possessed of the electric quality that had first attracted him in wartime London. "You look wonderful, Pamela," Averill said, his voice carrying the weight of years and genuine feeling. "I've missed our conversations." Marie was a wonderful woman, but she never understood politics the way you do. "And I've missed having someone who appreciates that politics is just human nature writ large," Pamela replied, taking his arm with the naturalness of long intimacy. The courtship was discreet, but determined. Within months, they were married, and Pamela became Mrs. Pamela Harriman, a name that opened every door in Democratic Washington and came with a fortune estimated at over $75 million. But as she stood beside him at their wedding reception, accepting congratulations from senators and ambassadors, Pamela felt a familiar mixture of triumph and foreboding. She had achieved the ultimate prize, but she had also committed herself to caring for an elderly man whose best years were behind him. The security she had always craved was finally hers, but the price was her freedom to be anything other than the perfect widow in waiting. The girl from Dorset had climbed to the very summit of American society, but the view from the top was both exhilarating and terrifying. There was nowhere higher to go, and the fall, when it came, would be very long indeed. Chapter 4. The Washington Throne. This chapter depicts Pamela's transformation into the unofficial queen of Democratic Washington following her marriage to Pamela Harriman. Her Georgetown salon becomes the epicenter of party politics, where future presidents are groomed and policies are shaped over French cuisine and fine wine. She discovers her true calling as a political strategist and fundraiser, using the Harriman fortune to build a machine of influence that extends far beyond her husband's lifetime. However, the chapter also explores the psychological cost of this success. As Averill ages and declines, Pamela finds herself increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by power brokers seeking her favor. The crisis erupts after Averill's death in 1986, when his children launch a devastating legal assault, accusing her of manipulating their father and squandering millions of the family fortune on her political ambitions. The lawsuit exposes not just financial irregularities, but the fundamental loneliness of a woman who has spent her entire life performing for others. The twist reveals that while she was building her political empire, trusted advisors were systematically looting the very fortune she had sacrificed everything to obtain, leaving her legally vulnerable and emotionally bankrupt despite her public triumph. The Georgetown mansion glowed like a beacon of democratic power on this cold January evening. Inside, senators mingled with policy experts, future presidential candidates tested their ideas on sympathetic audiences, and Pamela Harriman orchestrated it all with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. At 56, she had found her true calling, not as someone's wife, but as the unofficial architect of democratic strategy. The dinner party tonight was typical of what had become known as Pamela's Tuesdays, carefully curated gatherings where the future of the party was debated over perfectly prepared cuisine. She moved through the rooms with practiced grace, ensuring that the young governor from Arkansas had time with the California donor, that the policy wonk from Brookings connected with the senator from Massachusetts. "You've created something remarkable here," observed Clark Clifford, the legendary Washington insider, as he watched her work. "This isn't just a salon, it's the Democratic Party's brain trust." "Politics is just matchmaking on a grand scale," Pamela replied with a smile that had charmed 3 decades of powerful men. "I simply help people find what they need in each other, but beneath the polished surface, darker currents flowed." Averill, now 85, was increasingly frail, spending most evenings in his study while his wife managed the empire they had built together. She had become his voice, his representative, the guardian of his legacy and fortune. Averill's death at 94 left Pamela, at 66, in control of one of America's great fortunes. The funeral was a state occasion in all but name. with former presidents and current senators filling the pews of St. John's Episcopal Church. But even as she accepted condolences with appropriate dignity, Pamela understood that her real battles were just beginning. The Harriman children had watched her 20-year marriage to their father with barely concealed resentment. They saw her not as a devoted wife, but as an interloper who had isolated their father from his family while systematically positioning herself to inherit what they considered their birthright. The first shot was fired 3 months after the funeral. A lawsuit, filed by Averell's daughters and grandchildren, alleged that Pamela and her financial advisors had breached their fiduciary duty, squandering over $40 million of the family trust on high-risk investments to fund her extravagant lifestyle and political activities. The legal battle consumed the next several years, playing out in courtrooms and newspaper headlines with equal viciousness. The accusations were devastating: that she had manipulated an elderly man, isolated him from his family, and systematically looted his fortune to build her own political empire. Some charges were unfair. She had been a devoted wife to Averell, giving him companionship and purpose in his final years. But others cut closer to the bone. She had indeed used the Harriman fortune to fund her political activities, had indeed made investment decisions that benefited her at the expense of his heirs, had indeed lived with a lavishness that even great wealth could not indefinitely sustain. The twist came when her own lawyers revealed the full extent of the financial mismanagement. The trusted advisors she had relied upon, the men in expensive suits who had promised spectacular returns, had been systematically draining the fortune through a series of disastrous investments. A hotel venture in New Jersey, a failing radio station, high-risk real estate deals that existed primarily on paper. The list of financial catastrophes was staggering. How could this happen? Pamela demanded during a meeting with her legal team, her voice icy despite the tremor in her hands. "I trusted you to protect what Averell built. The cash flow requirements for your lifestyle and political activities were substantial," one lawyer replied carefully. "We were trying to generate the income you needed to maintain your position." The brutal irony was inescapable. She had spent her entire life accumulating wealth to ensure her security, only to watch that wealth evaporate through the incompetence and greed of the very men she had trusted to protect it. The settlement, when it finally came, was both victory and defeat. Pamela retained control of a substantial portion of the estate, but at a cost that went far beyond the millions paid to Averell's children. Her reputation, so carefully cultivated over decades, lay in ruins. The press had branded her the ultimate gold digger, a woman who had used her beauty and charm to manipulate 3 wealthy husbands before finally hitting the jackpot. But perhaps the cruelest cut was the loneliness. As she sat in the Georgetown house after the settlement, surrounded by the paintings and furniture she had fought so hard to keep, Pamela understood that she had won the battle, but lost something more precious than money. The people around her now, the staff, the advisors, the political figures who still sought her support, all wanted something from her. She could no longer distinguish between genuine affection and calculated interest. The girl from Dorset, who had feared poverty above all else, had achieved wealth beyond measure. But she had paid for it with the one thing she had never thought to value: the simple knowledge of being loved for herself rather than for what she could provide. As she prepared for bed in the master suite that had once belonged to one of America's great statesmen, Pamela Harriman, widow, survivor, political kingmaker, faced the ultimate irony of her carefully constructed life. She had everything she had ever wanted, and she had never been more alone. The machine of influence she had built would continue to function. The political empire she had created would outlast her. But the woman at its center remained what she had always been: a frightened girl from an impoverished estate, still running from the specter of being nobody, still unable to stop long enough to discover who she might have been if she had ever felt safe enough to simply be herself. Chapter 5: The Final Performance. In her final chapter, Pamela achieves the ultimate vindication through her appointment as U.S. Ambassador to France, a position that validates her lifetime of political networking and fundraising. At 73, she finally holds power in her own right, representing the world's most powerful nation in the city, where she once reinvented herself as a sophisticated divorce. Yet even this triumph is shadowed by the ongoing legal battles and financial pressures that have consumed the fortune she spent her life accumulating. The narrative explores her final months in Paris, where she maintains her legendary entertaining style while privately grappling with the knowledge that her legacy will forever be complicated by scandal and accusation. Her death by cerebral hemorrhage in the Ritz Hotel swimming pool is both sudden and symbolic, a final exit from the stage where she had performed for over 7 decades. The resolution examines the complex legacy she leaves behind, a woman who broke barriers and wielded unprecedented influence, but who paid for her success with authenticity and genuine human connection. The story concludes with a meditation on the price of ambition and the eternal question of whether she was ultimately a victor or victim of the world she navigated so skillfully. The appointment as United States Ambassador to France was Pamela Harriman's ultimate vindication. At 73, she stood in the grand reception room of the Hôtel de Pontalba, the same city where she had once been a divorced woman of questionable reputation, seeking her fortune among the ruins of post-war Europe. Now she represented the most powerful nation on earth, appointed by President Bill Clinton in recognition of her decades of political organizing and fundraising. The irony was not lost on her. She had returned to Paris not as a refugee from scandal, but as the embodiment of American diplomatic power. The French, who understood the game of influence better than most, received her with a mixture of admiration and knowing respect. They recognized in her story something quintessentially French, the triumph of intelligence and strategic thinking over the accidents of birth. Her embassy became what her Georgetown salon had been, a place where relationships were forged and deals were struck over exquisite food and wine. She brought together French politicians, American business leaders, and cultural figures, creating the same kind of synergy that had made her legendary in Washington. She was, by most accounts, an excellent ambassador, precisely because she had spent her entire life learning how to navigate between different worlds and make powerful people feel important. But the past had a way of casting shadows even over the brightest achievements. The legal battles with the Harriman family had drained both resources and energy. The fortune that had once seemed inexhaustible was revealed to be substantial but not infinite, and much of it had been consumed by legal fees and settlements. The woman who had spent her life accumulating wealth was discovering that wealth, like everything else, was ultimately temporary. She maintained her schedule with characteristic determination, hosting dinners and attending functions with the same attention to detail that had marked her entire career. But those closest to her noticed signs of fatigue, moments when the famous charm seemed to require more effort than it once had. On the morning of February 5th, she followed her usual routine at the Ritz Hotel, where she maintained a suite and took her daily swim. The pool was empty, the water pristine, the silence broken only by the gentle sound of her measured strokes. She was alone with her thoughts, as she had been for most of her life, despite being constantly surrounded by people. The cerebral hemorrhage struck without warning as she completed her morning laps. She was 76 years old, still serving as ambassador, still working to maintain the networks and relationships she had built over a lifetime. The end came swiftly, a sudden, merciful exit before the full weight of age and accumulated battles could diminish the legend she had become. The obituaries that followed struggled to capture the complexity of her life. To some, she remained the ultimate gold digger who had used her beauty and charm to climb from impoverished nobility to the heights of American power. To others, she was a pioneering woman who had played by the only rules available to her generation, turning the limitations imposed by gender and era into opportunities for influence and achievement. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. She had been born into a world where women's value was determined by their marriages, where beauty and breeding were currencies to be invested wisely. She had learned those lessons perhaps too well, applying them with a ruthlessness that made her both successful and isolated. The memorial service at Washington National Cathedral drew hundreds of mourners, presidents and senators, diplomats and socialites, the powerful and famous whose lives she had touched over 7 decades. The eulogies were careful, praising her energy, her political acumen, her dedication to the Democratic Party, while skirting the more controversial aspects of her biography. But perhaps the most honest assessment came not from the podium, but from the private conversations afterward. Those who had known her personally spoke of her loneliness despite being surrounded by people, her restlessness despite achieving everything she had sought, her inability to ever feel secure despite accumulating vast wealth and influence. The settlement of her estate revealed the final irony. The fortune she had controlled so carefully was smaller than many had assumed, much of it consumed by her spending and the legal battles that had marked her final years. The letters and papers that emerged showed a woman more complex than either her admirers or critics had understood, someone who had indeed calculated her moves carefully, but who had also genuinely loved some of the men she had been accused of merely using. Her son Winston, now in his 50s, inherited what remained of her fortune along with the burden of a name that carried both prestige and scandal. Their relationship had been complicated, marked by long periods of distance and the inevitable resentments that came from being the child of someone whose attention was always focused on the next opportunity, the next relationship, the next reinvention. The swimming pool at the Ritz, where Pamela Harriman spent her final conscious moments, was a fitting end for someone who had spent her entire life in motion, always swimming toward the next goal, the next opportunity. She had never stopped long enough to ask whether the destination was worth the journey, whether the wealth and power she had accumulated had brought her the happiness and security she had sought. The girl who had grown up at Minturn Magna, watching her parents struggle to maintain appearances on a declining fortune, had succeeded beyond measure by conventional standards. She had climbed from impoverished nobility to the highest circles of American power, had wielded influence that would have been unimaginable to the women of her mother's generation, had left a mark on history that no amount of scandal could entirely erase. But the question that haunted those who tried to understand her life was whether she had ever felt truly secure, whether any amount of wealth or power could have filled the void created by a childhood spent watching her family's slow decline. She had run from poverty and powerlessness her entire life, but she had perhaps never escaped the fear that had driven her from the beginning. In the end, Pamela Harriman's life posed uncomfortable questions about the nature of ambition, the price of security, and the ways society shapes the choices available to women. She had played the game brilliantly, by rules she had not created, but had mastered completely. She had used every advantage, her beauty, her intelligence, her aristocratic background, her understanding of power, to build a life of influence and wealth. But she had also paid for that success in ways that were difficult to quantify, in authenticity, in genuine connection, in the peace that comes from knowing you are valued for who you are, rather than what you can provide. The scandalous life of Pamela Harriman was ultimately a tragedy disguised as a triumph, the story of a woman who conquered the world, but may have lost herself in the process. Whether she was victim or victor, predator or survivor, remains a question each observer must answer for themselves. What cannot be disputed is that she lived on her own terms in a world that offered women few choices, and that she left that world forever changed by her passage through it.